The world's most disturbing anime, the most disgusting OVA, the movie that got banned throughout the entire world. Whichever manner of self-aggrandizing exaggeration folks choose to describe it with, it does feel weirdly inviting, right? Shoujo Tsubaki is a story that's been rotating all cozy in the back of my mind for the longest time. Eternal prisoner of forlorn thoughts and impressionistic daydreaming, forever obsessed with both its tragedy and beauty alike. You see, I remember finding discussions, hushed tones and whispers of its animated adaptation nestled in message boards all the way back when I was a kid. Users absolutely tantalized by the idea of challenging one another to watch something quote-unquote this messed up. Midori, Barefoot Gen, the set of Bounce Jack OVAs, the Devilman ones, Urotsuki Doji, you name them. Even though I find the practice a little gauche nowadays, especially considering the sheer amount of historical context that went on behind some of these, it still ended up lighting an absolute fire in my soul. It's how I found out about a ton of the stuff that would end up very near and dear to my heart. So to me, that exact feeling, that unhealthy obsession with curiosity, has always been a huge driving force behind pretty much everything I do. A fascinating inspiration hurling us towards exposing ourselves to all sorts of niche obscurities, solely for the fact of discovering whatever might even hide in there. There's a certain allure, a tangible appeal to the mystifying, the strange and the obscure. It's generally so captivating. And to have something like this, so rich in history and cultural context, with a reputation exceeding the legendary, it's almost too much for me to talk about. Midori is a piece of art that practically rewired my entire personality at a very young age, pushing me towards becoming an enthusiast of all kinds of fringe outsider art, always willing to discuss and seek out the earnesty that lies in the less appealing aspects of everyday life. Yet, despite my never-ending love for it, I've tried again and again to write and rewrite my thoughts about it for the better half of this year, in hopes of imparting that knowledge to someone, anyone, to finally get these feelings off my chest and just out there in the world. Thing is though, trying to talk about a piece of art like this immediately comes with its very apparent downsides. If you ask anyone about Midori, big chances they'll either A, won't know what you're talking about, which is probably the favorable outcome of the two, or B, calling you a sick weirdo for enjoying that sort of thing. But the thing is, I don't really understand why it's got such an overblown reputation amongst Western anime fans, at least the most mainstream ones. For as much as we hear about Shoujo Tsubaki in recent years, with folks stuck in a never-ending cycle of finding out and getting up in arms about it, I tend to find that the conversation surrounding it is swamped by misconceptions and bad faith arguments by reactionaries who probably didn't even bother watching the whole thing, oftentimes more interested in debating whether or not its shocking content holds artistic merit and cultural value, rather than discussing its heart and what that entails altogether. And honestly, I don't really fuck with the idea of talking about stuff based on criteria like if they hold any value or not. That's really rigid of an approach to have when analyzing art. Because to me, Midori is one of the best stories ever told, but so many people online talk about it as if it's some kind of grimdark creepypasta, instead of this heartbreakingly tragic tale. Or even on a more technical basis, this passion project years in the making of an artist who practically staked his entire life savings on it. You hear about the movie almost exclusively because of its reputation as the most banned anime ever, despite that fact being blatantly exaggerated. Somehow the rumors caught on, and now years down the line we've got this local internet weirdo here trying to course correct things in a video that will most definitely be watched either tabbed out or on someone's second screen. So today I'm more interested in talking about Shoujo Tsubaki's actual factual content, what it means to me and what value I found in its depths, recess of excess, ugliness, and of course its beauty. So don't take this as a video essay, a review, or whatever kind of label you want to stick to it. None of my shit ever is. I have legit zero interest in talking about whether the art on display truly fits the reputation of quote-unquote most fucked up thing ever, nor do I think those subject matters are any indictment of an artist's moral viewpoints either. I don't even particularly care about coming at it from an informational point of view. I've always operated on vibes and feelings alone. So here it's important I cut through the crap and talk about everything it depicts in great detail, which also means it's important that I leave as much as possible unaltered, and that I don't try to skirt around or compromise Shoujo Tsubaki's integrity as what it is, a pretty traumatizing, emotionally focused piece. So take my word, this consolidated internet diary is gonna go some places. Pretty uncomfortable ones, but I think that's important to this entire thing's ethos. I'm gonna have to ask all of you to get real fucking cool with some shit real fast, otherwise we're not gonna get anywhere. As a general disclaimer, this vid just ain't gonna be for everyone. I'm gonna be talking pretty candidly about human emotions, sometimes pretty ugly ones, in hopes of getting not just the artist's point across, but my own as well. I'm not gonna go out of my way to put anything objectionable on screen, but subject matters remain the same. Also, just to make things a little clearer before we start, when I talk of the manga, I'll be using its original Japanese name, shoujo tsubaki, and when I talk about the animated adaptation, I'll be using its localized name, Midori. As for the rest, full spoilers ahead. While it'd be easy to talk about Midori's origins as an adaptation stemming exclusively from Suehiro Marua's seminal masterpiece, after all, the manga was serialized in this incredibly influential seinen magazine called Garo, this repository for all sorts of alternate comic artists with varieties of art styles that typically didn't fit within your more traditional outlets. The truth is, it runs a whole lot deeper than that. Shoujo tsubaki, like the story itself, originated first and foremost way beforehand in the traditional form of kamishibai, 1930s era paper theaters spread throughout Japan. Before becoming common street attractions, those were used by monks in Buddhist temples to read picture scrolls in order to convey stories to mostly illiterate audiences, usually containing a moral or a lesson of some kind. Think of it like the Showa era equivalent to what I'm doing here on YouTube. Midori, the Camellia Girl, was a regularly featured character for that sort of performance, usually depicted as a young girl, a teenager, impoverished and forced to live alone on the streets, typically resorting to selling what little she has to hopefully make by. Suehiro Marua's adaptation of Shoujo tsubaki comes from a 21-volume play by Naniwa Seiyun, the actual author behind Midori's story. Except in its original version, instead of being sent off to a freak show, human traffickers force her to perform in a revue show, and near the end her parents come to rescue her, the story effectively having this relatively played straight good ending of a family reunited through harsh circumstances. Marua's reimagining, meanwhile, is a lot more interested in reusing that premise, one of an ingenue flower seller, recontextualized entirely within era guro fashion. The juxtaposition of the character's perceived virginal beauty overlapped onto extreme bouts of gratuitous violence, with pretty poignant depictions of trauma anchored in those very real feelings. All of this bookended by a tragic ending that deviates pretty fucking heavily from Seiyun's original story. To get everyone on the same page, here's a very truncated form of the overall plot. Shoujo tsubaki is the story of Midori, young soon-to-be orphan girl forced to work in the streets of her town, selling camellia flowers to strangers in hopes of helping out back home. Her family status is left fairly ambiguous. Her mother is sick, and her father's just gone. Something I always thought was meant to be interpreted as her dad having died in the war, knowing this is taking place in the Showa era, either right during or nearly after World War II. So nestled in dark corners, she waits hoping for a life that will seemingly never be hers. When she eventually makes it back home to discover her mom's lifeless body being literally gnawed on by rats, she's convinced by a man to join a circus and leave all her troubles behind. Thing is, from that point onward, only an endless spiral of both physical and psychological torment awaits for her. All of it perpetrated by the rest of the cast of our story. Circus carnies, perverse and malicious, just oozing that stranger danger vibe wherever they find themselves. Something illustrated beautifully by simple details, like even just the first time they meet her. They all huddle up close to her, forcefully invading her personal space and making those awkward comments. You can clearly tell you're meant to feel extremely uncomfortable for her. And rightfully so, because the prequel chapter ends up on Midori quite literally getting sexually assaulted by the whole crew. The final page sending actual chills down my spine when her only commentary on all of this happening is a weak and dejected, "I wanna go to the picnic." Truly heartbreaking shit. The story continues the cycle of abuse even further, and Midori slowly finds herself retracting from reality, daydreaming of a world without pain and all sorts of hallucinated fantasies. Until one day, out of sheer chance, she meets a man. Wonder Masamitsu, a Western-style illusionist master who joins the troupe and effectively twists turn upside down the entire setting and its cast on their heads. Overnight fortune for a circus that's been drenched in money troubles, and for once, Midori's finally able to gain some modicum of security. Masamitsu takes her under his arm and guarantees that as long as she's with him, she'll be safe from her co-workers' ceaseless bullying. As the story progresses, we see Midori turning from friend to lover, and lover to wife. Finally saved from the torment she's experienced on the daily, we get a small glimpse at our young protagonist finally being able to safely transition from childhood to teenage years in an almost normal manner considering the story we're witnessing here. As small as that piece is, its repercussions are felt throughout the entirety of the remaining chapters. Midori ends up getting scouted as a young talent by a movie director who approaches her with a job opportunity. Finally, an actual tangible escape from her life of servitude. Yet almost immediately that joy is cut tremendously short, this time by Wonder Masamitsu himself forbidding her from leaving. While we're aware of his actions as fairly oppressive throughout the run of the manga, just a few chapters prior he's gone out of his way to brutally murder Muchisute, the mummy man, taking an almost sadistic pleasure in tormenting him with remnants of his own memories, to the point of taunting him by copying his appearance from before he lost his arm. It's only at this point that Midori herself fully comes to accept it. The bleak reality that their arrangement, their entire relationship, is one hinging on an obsessive nature, a man who seeks and is motivated solely by control as a concept. Control of his appearance, of his reputation, and now of his wife. As the story wraps up, we find Midori having seemingly given up on true freedom, still under the care of the magician, deciding to fully rely on him and to go towards wherever he sees fit, almost out of sheer resignation. Finally leaving the circus life behind, there's this inkling of hope just out there in the horizon, still shining even if only a little. While they're waiting for a bus leading to the outside world, Masamitsu goes to buy food only to get absolutely fucking shanked by some thief, dying in the streets like a dog. In a cruel twist of fate, this kinda embodies one of his greatest fears. He ends up being completely ignored and rejected by the world around him. Midori, left alone once more in her anxious desperation, finds herself completely overwhelmed by the gravity of the situation, thrusted into endless nightmarish visions until finally, only she remains. This small, weak thing spiraling at the mercy of all that's been happening around her, left alone in this giant blank page. The only thing she's able to do is to cry her heart out. While a story like this, so bereft of filter, might be surprising for some, if even a little questionable for others, to me, this whole thing represented this sort of intoxicating awakening. When I first read through shoujo tsubaki, I was at an age that was still incredibly impressionable, so to indulge into something so profoundly different than anything else I'd enjoyed at the time felt kinda surreal. And even though my first read was in the early to mid 2000s, nearly 20 years detached from its original magazine run, the emotions present throughout the entire story felt so presciently real, and still manages to do so still to this day. Each page, panel, singular line occupying my mind like a noxious curse, forever taunted by the darkest reaches of humanity's raw perversions. And part of me can't help but wonder if its original release had a similar reaction back in the day. A sort of twisted nucleus for all kinds of people realizing the potential of what art as a medium can show and realistically portray. I mean, it's 1983, and Suehiro Maruo, this 28-year-old weirdo, just shows up in the world of era guro manga, one already known for its blatant mixing of eroticism, bizarre imagery, and grotesque, almost nonsensical elements, yet still manages to make a name for himself in a landscape like that. Dude just straight up slapped this shit on an editor's desk only a few years after getting turned down by Weekly Shonen Jump for being quote-unquote too graphic for their standards. To stand out like this is such a massive power move if I've ever seen one. That era too was almost synonymous with the desire to explore those weird recesses, so it's extremely fitting of him. Japan's economic boom of the time dictated that horror and all forms of erotic material found even more of a market appeal and constant demand, moving from shady corners to big and bigger publications, getting all sorts of traction along the way. Home video treasure troves like the guinea pig movies that saw Hideshi Ino's involvement with them, manga magazines yet afflicted by restriction as to what can or can't be shown. Maruo was effectively coasting off pure adrenaline at the time, showcasing his vision of stories told entirely without restrictions, limits, or even possibility of censorship. All of this in hopes of featuring truly twisted glimpses of a society rotting at its core, constantly back-to-back representing various unspeakable elements coming straight from our most secretive human emotions. And in a way, I can't help but vibe with that on a sort of primal level. You know, Japan was already hella familiar with that sort of art being in demand, but its proliferation in the late 1980s, even all the way to the early 2000s, was completely unprecedented. It was a shockwave whose effects were yet to be felt throughout the entire landscape, but is now in retrospect massively under-talked about. There's always been a desire present, especially in analyzing and studying matters like these. From as early as the 1920s, there was a widespread interest surrounding the investigation of the quote-unquote darker sides of society, modernity hitting its logical apex, the transition into postmodernity giving way for people to freely explore ideas like the most basic of human taboos. A lot of the works I enjoy from that era seem to talk almost exclusively at lengths about very nuanced concepts like identity, perception, sexuality, psychology, and behaviors deemed unacceptable by newly founded standards of the era. And all of that more than applies to the art made by Suehiro Maruo as well. I mean, right from the get-go, it's pretty obvious that his entire ethos is one of mixing the erotic, the grotesque, the extravagant, the beautiful, and the objectionable all together. each element masterfully coexisting in the same space as this reminder of humanity's qualities and downfalls equally. All of this drenched and deeply anchored within cultural notions of Japanese history, with clearly visible landmarks and iconography. Moving on from traditional yokais and historical figures, Maruo's work would take on qualities from art found all the way back in the Edo period, like the ukiyo-e, those very ornate, beautiful paintings or woodblock prints. Except here, the almost calligraphy-esque elegance is traded in, substituted wholesale with portrayals of truly horrific nature. The illustrations he expertly crafts are obviously taking huge inspo from other works like those of Tsukioka Yoshitoshi, more specifically his 1866 to 1869 series of prints aptly named 28 Famous Murders with Verses. Each of those pieces effectively retelling historical mentions of famous deaths and acts of violence. Suehiro Maruo would even go as far as referencing this work directly in his very own way, a completely new iteration for a new generation, called Bloody Ukiyo-e, or The New Atrocities in Blood, a book that features art by both him and fellow Garo collaborator Kazuichi Hanawa. This time around, each rendition wouldn't be tied solely to Japanese history and folklore, but instead cover a wide variety of sources and emotions. Post-World War II catharsis, not-so-sneaky Dr. Caligari reference, pop culture icons, and tragic happenings of the last century or so. Each piece accompanied with a short paragraph, a brief commentary of feelings and thoughts usually pertaining to what drove people to such display of grotesquely dark imagery, bizarre sexual acts, occultic rituals, or outright psychosexual violence. Similarly of cultural relevancy, not just shoujo tsubaki, but nearly every one of his stories take place during the Showa era, so like anywhere between 1920s to 1980s Japan, something pretty commonly found within other Gekiga comics of the time. Their more serious tone and nature oftentimes calling back to that post-war period, thinking specifically of stories like Barefoot Gen. Most folks know it for the first of two OVAs being one of those Russian roulette-style titles you'd get dared to watch by some asshole friends, but honestly, the whole thing is this really poignant, extremely sad retelling of actually lived experiences coming straight from a survivor of the atomic bomb in Hiroshima. Another really good example is Yoshiharu Tsuge's Neji Shiki, or Screw Style, the story of an unnamed boy who just wanders through war-torn towns in hopes of finding a doctor who could potentially fix his life-threatening injury. A cut artery just flirting here and there. Shoujo Tsubaki is no different, though maybe a little more obfuscated in how it chooses to comment on those events, at least for foreigners who don't have the proper context to analyze stuff like the rampant post-war nationalism felt within that era. I sure as hell didn't as a kid. Nor do I really have a solid grasp on it nowadays other than like the very basic gist of it. I just thought the art looked cool and weird and bizarre and didn't have the same vibes as anything else I had read at the time. Something purposely by design, as Maruo went out of his way to maintain a certain level of ambiguity through it all, specifically oscillating between the dates to remain vague and loosely creating these pristine, almost anachronistic views of the era. Vertical slices overlapping each other, making each scenery feel truly unique amongst one another's. One of his major stylistic touchstones is the predominant presence of so-called human oddities. Whether that be birth defects, physical disabilities, or any other ailment, it's practically impossible to look at his illustrations and not feel like there's some kind of deep-seated commentary about the treatment of people deemed unconventional by society. Just layers deep within all that viscera. War-torn amputees, only the shadiest of antagonists, plagued by extreme mental fog, and of course, protags harboring an almost overly pure look to themselves, constantly contrasting the cruelty onto the primal idea of the untainted character as an ideology, one entirely free of the ugliness that covers the entirety of the world surrounding them. There really is something akin to love in making what are fairly complex topics, pretty multifaceted ones at that, with notions of postmodernism accessible to pretty much anyone reading it by effortlessly juxtaposing language and image itself, back and forthing between the casual and the scholarly. I think ideally, writing, or really any creative pursuits in any shape or form, should be driven not just by thoughts, but especially emotions, vibes, and feelings. So it's good to see that echoed by artists and writers that clearly got their shit together more than I do. That sort of raw, pristine, emotion-based storytelling is such a big factor that drives me towards pretty much anything made by Suehiro Maruo. The fact that he's never been afraid to talk about some pretty sensitive topics, some still relatively awkward to detail to this day, like how in The Laughing Vampire, there's this huge emphasis on the portrayal of older women as being also capable of pretty disturbing acts, some of them acting increasingly predatory towards our very young protagonists. And to me, that feels incredibly potent and super refreshing, especially in a world where fiction mostly shows the inverse scenario. Subsequently, I think it's really cool how those stories, in and of themselves, push their audience into reflecting about the feelings evoked and inherently stemming from the nature of something like Eroguro's natural contradictions. From beauty, elegance, and mystery, to confusion, shock, and nausea. I mean, right from the get-go, the framing of the man who buys Midori's flowers in the early part of the prequel chapter really does say it all. It comes off as weirdly touchy, sleazy. Midori even mentions that the moon's able to see them, almost implying some degree of shame to the action she's forced to take to survive. And that's only ever accentualized by Maruo's art style going all out in portraying exactly that. Complex feelings that don't always have exact words to describe them. Disparate differences clashing against each other, forming this beautiful amalgamation of stress and relief all at once. Beauty and tragedy dancing as closely as possible, interchange rapidly into a vortex of stream of consciousness. And look, I know, I'm an absolute fucking buffoon. I've never been above liking art that looks relatively strange to some. My stylistic sensibilities aren't exactly what you'd call common, or even in touch with my fellow contemporaries. I like weird shit. I like ugly shit. I like any matter of idiosyncratic art that truly yells out someone's identity. But just hear my eclectic ass out for a second. Suehiro Maruo's art is straight up beautiful. Plainly gorgeous. I've got no words that come even close to describing it. The amount of love and attention poured into representing the sheer rawness his art style embodies. It goes so fucking hard, dog. Just take a look at some of the hallucination segments presented in shoujo tsubaki. The art style purposefully changing, morphing into a more shoujo-esque candor. It's used not just to reflect Midori's degrading mental state, but also coincides perfectly with that sort of vibe, of beautiful anguish. The chapter where this is all happening starts off with these incredibly distressing images of Midori slowly walking through a dark corridor, only to immediately knock you back into your seat with these almost overly cute renditions of the main cast. I think it's pretty obvious that it's purposely trying to mimic other popular art styles of the era, but honestly, I kinda find it creepy. A little bit like how Kazuo Umezu manages to portray scariness through really pristine characters, schoolgirls whose faces actively contort into abject terror. In the end, so much of what Maruo does, alongside many of his contemporaries, is to willingly expose oneself to the depths of humanity's potential for depravity, to talk openly about polite society's darkest anxieties, propensities for corrupt thoughts taking physical form, drawn in beautifully impure nightmares, and how we as humans tend to react to conversations surrounding topics like those. Something only really possible because of the loosening of restriction as to what can be discussed regarding societal taboos. That's something extremely visible the moment you take a dive into Japan's artistic communities and the overall scene he was active in. I mentioned some culturally relevant stuff earlier, but honestly, his inspirations aren't something I really hear talked about when folks mention his works in the first place. It's pretty obvious that the dude's very well versed in all manner of historical references, specifically pertaining to Japan's history and his own upbringing there. But there's also a ton of other good stuff too, like how he keeps inserting pop culture figures, or even real-ass people, notably murderers, into his stories. Like how in The Laughing Vampire, he didn't just put an Onibaba in there, there's also this straight-up John Wayne Gacy looking-ass clown showing up straight out of nowhere. Most defo a commentary about the brutal nature of Maruo's entire body of work. And yes, before you ask, the clown acts exactly how you think he would, but it's okay. He gets his own comeuppance in the form of throat slashing and dick severing by two of our protagonists. Good stuff all around. Similarly, Suehiro Maruo seems to take huge inspiration from the 1920s German expressionist film, The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari. A movie I was first introduced to by one of my older sisters just leaving it laying around in her room while she wasn't there, at an age that was maybe a little too young for me to properly understand all of its intricacies, but what can I say? Fuck it, we ball. Not only are Maruo's characters typically that same brand of black-haired, empty eyes, perpetually tired-looking emo twinks, which I fucking love by the way, he also tends to just straight up draw Cesar, like the actual main character of the movie. There's entire pages in his multi-issue art book Maruograph that dedicate themselves solely to him, though never limited to one obsession alone. There's also a ton of other notable figures in there too. The monk from Kwaidan, Christopher Lee's Dracula, Nosferatu, Frankenstein, Rocky Horror Picture Show, and of course we get some more post-World War II feelings in there as a bonus. Is that fucking Yukio Mishima over there? Get his 5'1" ass out of here. His art for Teito Monogatari specifically was one to drive this massive wedge into my brain at a super young age. I didn't really have the words nor the knowledge to describe why I thought it looked so cool, yet carried with it this absolutely ominous vibe as well. Like just the resulting mix of occultic Western-style magic overlapped onto the more grounded nature of something like a military uniform felt weirdly haunting to my sense of style. Another point of inspo, this time specifically pertaining to shoujo tsubaki, is 1932's Freaks by Todd Browning. Pretty obvious one at that, especially considering the setting of a circus tent surrounding a cast of various performers. Despite it being considered a classic by many, it's a movie I've kinda avoided by sheer accident for almost all of my life. I've only really watched it in the run-up to making this video. A big reason as to why is that so many people speak of it almost exclusively as a horror film. But really, I kinda find it to be the diametric opposite. Like yeah, there's a fairly suspenseful final scene, but even that is a lot more comedic in tone than it's actively horrific. In my mind, the movie's more concerned with displaying the humanity of each performer rather than anything actually factually nefarious. Though I guess to a certain degree it does kinda err on the edge of exploitative for fairly obvious reasons, which I guess also beats the purpose of trying to humanize your cast if you're actively ogling at them through a camera, but you get what I mean, right? A big part of the appeal is what it was trying to do, even if the execution was a little wonky along the way. Not filming any of the performers actually performing circus acts helps in conveying to an audience of the time, which, let's be honest, mostly consisted of prejudiced as fuck people, that they're humans just like them, and that their lives don't differ in any significant way bar physical disabilities. There's a certain level of earnesty that comes in showing that sort of empathy. To say that no matter who you are, you have the same propensity for love, for fear, for sadness, and joy than anyone else. So taking in the cultural context that came from the time of its creation, it's kinda wild to me that a movie like this even saw the light of day, especially considering the amount of contemporary critics citing it exclusively for its horrific merits, which says a lot more about them than it does about the cast. Because really, all I can think about is how beautiful solidarity is, and how the human heart extends beyond the bounds of physical appearance. True heart-to-heart connection type beat. In that way, I almost consider it to not just be an inspiration, but also to be a sort of anti-shoujo tsubaki. Though realistically it's more like the other way around where shoujo tsubaki is the anti-freaks, but you get what I mean. Something that unfortunately cannot be said about its 2016 live-action adaptation, Midori the Camellia Girl. A movie more suited to being some sort of alternate reality Malice Miser music video where Gak never left the band. Instead we got the reality where he went on to become a gambler in Thailand? Fuck my life, dog. He's been gone full-on old man mode recently, like, what do you mean you want Japan to go back to its Edo-era style isolation? You don't even live there anymore. You've been living in Malaysia for like 12 years. Does he not get the irony of saying something like that while also actively living in a country that was once occupied by Japan? Anyway, fuck, what was I saying? Midori 2016 feels a lot more like a fan project uploaded straight to YouTube, a la circa 2010 fan-made trailer, than an actual adaptation. And I don't know, I kinda find some charm in that. It has this very homemade, scrappy feeling to it. The whole thing has a really low-budget feel. Every set is basked in these very unnatural vibes. Big blurs, bright lighting, and weirdly plasticky atmosphere that makes the whole thing feel both overly and underly competent. And I don't even mean that as a dig. I think it's a really cool stylistic approach, all things considered. It calls back not just to Suehiro Maruo's typical use of anachronistic elements, vertical slices of different eras, but also kinda mirrors the other shoujo tsubaki adaptations, each of them kinda twisting the original context further and further, effectively creating something new out of it every time. And even though the movie ended up not really doing all that much for me, I still got huge respect for what it was trying to do. Plus, the casting they went with is absolutely fucking bonkers. Like, I don't give a shit about quality or whatever the fuck you choose to do when it comes to creative liberties. That stuff doesn't matter right now. But you're telling me you casted the voice of fucking Yugi Muto, like Yami Yugi himself, the Pharaoh Atem of all people, to be Wonder Masamitsu? Same thing for Kanabun being played by Takeru, like the J-rock singer from Shug. Some truly bizarre world decisions here. Shoujo Tsubaki might not translate perfectly into live action, not that I expected it to do so in the first place, but it still got some really cool vibes along the way. Though, all things considered, it doesn't dethrone the one true adaptation still out there in the world. Of course, I'm talking about the multimedia interactive CD-ROM here. Yup, I mentioned it very briefly in my last video, but here we are. Very similar to the Nekojiro one, both in style and method of acquisition, this came bundled with an issue of Gyro and is basically the story wholesale, but retold through PowerPoint-style presentation and low-poly retro CG, with some admittedly very charmingly colored renditions of certain panels, animated or otherwise. Really dig the prototypical CGI look to it. That's mostly because I'm biased with those extremely niche sensibilities, especially when it comes to like early to mid 90s multimedia projects. Though, now that's all said and done, we've only got one more adaptation left to talk about, and that one is probably the most important one in my eyes. Hey, real fast, before we go any further, since this video is most likely gonna get absolutely turbo fucked with a big yellow $sign by virtue of what I'm talking about here, I've got a Patreon, blah blah blah, you've heard it all before. If you like what I do, maybe consider pledging, or not, I don't gotta tell you what to do, but it's there for folks who feel particularly generous and like my stuff. I'm not gonna go out of my way and pretend that what I do here is particularly important, but I do enjoy being able to feed myself, so you know how it is. Anyway, thanks, let's get back to business. Nearly a decade after the release of the manga comes swinging Hiroshi Arata with Chika Gento Geki ga Shoujo Tsubaki, or most commonly known by its localized name, Midori, the Girl in the Freak Show, a proper, full-on adaptation of its source material now animated in peak lurid colors and violent images. I think to a certain degree the film adaptation almost eclipses the manga in terms of public perception, at least in my experience when talking about it in modern mainstream circles of interest. I hear a lot more folks chatting about it, or more likely actively discovering it, than I do about its source material. Well, like the Suehiro Maruo manga, not like the Kamishibai play. That I don't really hear anyone ever mentioning it, which honestly is kind of a shame because I like each adaptation almost equally, bar like the 2016 live action one, but I understand that the Arata produced OVA and its content tends to be the one to attract all the attention. Especially when you've got a lineage of all sorts of fuck freaks on the internet trying to convince you that the whole thing is this secret underground club for cool nerds only type beat. And honestly, I kinda get why. So many people nowadays hyper-focus on anything that can be even remotely considered banned or lost media in the biggest of quotation marks here, which I guess to a certain extent was what Midori counted as for Western fans since it wasn't exactly seen as accessible back then. That, on top of a decade's worth of rumors, ended up kinda muddling the discussion surrounding what's actually going on in there. So yeah, Hiroshi Arata was reportedly interested in adapting Shoujo Tsubaki for a few years, and only through sheer insistence did he finally get the okay from Suehiro Maruo after he himself felt pretty disappointed by the anime industry, specifically his relationship to other studios who had basically all but given up on producing an anime version of any of his works. He even went out of his way to give Harada some research material and historical notes he had during the making of the actual manga. Because of Arata's own personal tendencies and interest towards topics like harassment, social inequalities, and bullying, the film ended up taking a lot more of his own stylistic sensibilities along the way. The bigger focus on prejudice emphasizing its focal point into a truly abusive rendition of the story, displaying all sorts of visceral trauma for an audience almost unable to process it as it all came crashing down into them. This unfortunately had the side effect of causing producers to steer relatively clear from its production, so Hiroshi Arata had to spend from his own pocket to fund practically everything involved in the making of Midori. I wasn't joking earlier, dude actively staked his entire life savings and even his retirement fund to see this shit getting done. Aside from the voice cast, the music composed by J.A. Caesar, and the sound effects, the rest was entirely created by him. So not just animating, but drawing, painting, scripting, directing, working for 5 years straight until his vision finally coalesced into something tangible. And even though the admittedly way more than low budget shows a lot, the final product consisting mostly of static paintings, animation cells accompanied by very minimal movement like panning and zooming around, that vision was one so extremely idiosyncratic, it's hard not to fall in love with it immediately. Usually I'm not too keen on the idea of considering anime as like the de facto better version compared to their original non-animated counterparts, but here I just really love this fucking thing. It was pretty much my gateway at a young age into not just Suehiro Maruo's body of work, but so many others. Eragura goodness, transcendental movies, and all manners of transgressive art. It was like an assault on all senses, actively attacking my understanding of style itself, ripping it open and infecting it permanently. So, melodrama aside, I really fuck with it. Right from the get-go, the whole thing's got such an oppressive atmosphere. Kamishibai wooden blocks sounding off the start of this true cascade of emotions, all led by these throwbacks to traditional illustrations, monsters and yokais in the background, accompanied by an incredibly ominous narration, followed immediately by this austere look at each performer, showing you exactly what their whole deal is about. Midori's opening segment is just this massive tour de force, and it only keeps getting better from that point onwards. It really manages to set the mood in a matter of seconds, giving off the exact vibe you'd expect out of that kind of dingy and dark theater show. A performance you aren't meant to see, but one you can't look away from either. Something that's kinda lost on modern audiences nowadays is that originally Midori was only meant for theatrical releases. Not as in like cinemas, movies, and film theaters, but actual full-on theatrical shows with performers all under a massive tent. The film's first ever screening in May of 1992 was at the Mitake Jinja Shinto Shrine in Tokyo. It was complemented throughout the whole thing by all sorts of special effects performed in real time, like smoke bombs going off and confetti being thrown around the audience. Same for performers who would do stunts during the screening, going as far as having a now removed scene in the middle of the film where the theater was meant to close all their lights while a real fake earthquake would play out to everyone's surprise. Obviously this sort of thing wouldn't really work in home releases, but it's so cool they even thought of including that sort of level of audience interaction, almost crossing the threshold and turning you from a witness to an actively unwilling participant trapped within that nightmare. The further we get into it, the more we come to terms with the idea that this story is one deeply seated into despair as a concept. You know, despite that being fairly obvious from the source material, there really is something special about its OVA adaptation. Like every scene, by virtue of having to be animated, even if very limited movement-wise, stretches that pain a little bit further, constantly putting the proverbial knife back in the wound to a point where it becomes almost agonizing. Like I mentioned earlier, there's this scene near the very start of shoujo tsubaki that sees Midori coming home, only to find her mom's dead body getting eaten by rats. While the manga's pretty fucking vivid about its imagery, and never really shies away from showing you exactly what's going on, I feel like here, in animated form, it's almost amplified tenfold by the sheer viscerality of how it's presented. This extends even further into the scene right after that, turning one of Maru's double page spread into this incredibly atmospheric shot of power lines over this beautiful orange sky, panning all the way until you see poor Midori. Or even the colors in the scene where she meets all the circus folks. The purposeful choice to use purple and yellow in conjunction is so fucking cool. As silly as it is to say like that, the whole movie has a sort of pungent atmosphere to it. Like the colors are all so faded and it gives everyone this very ill, sickly look to them, making every scene feel both visibly and metaphorically unhealthy. On top of that, you're constantly presented with visuals that almost feel like real-life photography, but are clearly just very stylized renditions made to look like that. That's something I really love to see in anime and video games, that sort of mixed media appeal. Thinking specifically of the shots used all throughout Karakana, or the backgrounds used in VNs like Igarashi and Umineko. Like, heavily filtered pictures that still have real-life qualities to them, but feel almost distant, real but fake at the same time. Though that doesn't even come close to my favorite moment in the whole thing. There's this scene near the very end of the movie where Wander Masamitsu uses his tricks to send Midori temporarily back in the past, back to her hometown. And not only is it this really poignant moment in the story, but also the whole thing looks so fucking stylish. Like the contrast between Midori herself and the background is just gorgeous. And that's not even mentioning Hiroshi Arata's signature style peeking through, going all out near the end. It's like, for just a few glimpses, you can see the moment where the mask slips off, and this isn't just another adaptation, but rather Harada flexing all of his animation skills with these extremely fluid sequences, naturally nightmarish, but ever beautiful in doing so. Not just limited to the OVA exclusively, but also deeply ingrained in Suehiro Marua's version, is just this genuine, fully blown feeling of dread haunting the entire story. Everything, and I truly mean everything, takes part in contributing to that sort of atmosphere. Every element from the narration, the incredible voice cast, the score absolutely blasting ropes in the most ominous of ways, like evil ass shit trying its hardest to make you feel suffocated the whole time. The art on display continues on from Marua's sensibilities, with the same type of disgust overlapped onto beauty, but this time it's turned to fucking 11. The movie is a work of art entirely rooted within the assumption that its audience will be made both intentionally and unintentionally uncomfortable. Sheer raw viscerality in its tone, its visuals in such a way that it creates this legitimate, full-on anguish stuck in my heart. I love the shit out of it. I can't imagine it being done any other way. The whole thing fucking owns. Midori's got such an hallucinating aura to it. Like, it's something that truly wasn't meant to be seen, and I fuck hella with that. The idea to represent a world so hopeless, to constantly dangle that carrot on a stick in front of an audience like, oh, maybe things will get better, only to snatch it away nigh immediately is so powerful. The only thing you're left with by the end is this genuine sense of degradation, of filth, Like you ran through this entire marathon only to get slapped in the face with sheer abject reality. It is misery, it is sadistic, and it's entirely confident in doing what it does. Just like how Midori herself is held captive by the world around her, by the folks around, or even by herself at times, you yourself are held captive by Hiroshi Arata masterfully crafting an experience unlike anything else out there. It's this intense vortex of emotion constantly taunting you, and for me that stuff is just pristine, like a diamond for the artistically inclined. I struggle a lot to put in words those exact feelings, because for one, they're so incredibly subjective and deeply personal, but also because Midori's atmosphere is a really hard sell for a lot of people. For as much as I sing its praise on every rooftop, I think a lot of people don't really give it a proper chance because of its thematic grossness, if you get what I mean. It's a work that wholeheartedly challenges your perception of art, and I don't know, in a way it reminds me a lot of our own human nature. How curiosity kinda drives me endlessly towards that sort of enjoyment, of things that many people consider gross, or weird, or abnormal, and that I can't stop searching for. Because Midori's atmosphere, at least to me, almost crystallizes that very sense of curiosity. The same kind that drives people to look up photos of actual real-life dead bodies on the internet. That almost perverse enjoyment towards anything that conveys the sheer realness of our world. It's a little morbid maybe, but you get what I mean, right? Morbidity never ceases to be interesting because it's inherently something that not a lot of folks choose to willingly discuss. At least not in that sort of earnest heart-to-heart conversation type beat. It tends to be shoved to the side and forgotten, purposefully hidden away, but to me, it fucking gnaws at my soul every day, and it's entirely what fuels my interest, my passions, my drive into making videos like this one. You know, all in all, tying back to the intro, I just find the idea of curiosity itself to be super interesting. Like for me, when I watch something like Midori, at an age where I didn't really have the words or understanding to kind of figure out why I even liked it, why it made me feel that way, my body automatically shifts into this weird analytical mode. I obsessively read, reread, watch, and rewatch all sorts of things just to get a better glimpse as to what even made me react that way. Constantly trying to figure out what the media I love so much even do to provoke me, to make me question it, and I find it really fun. And now that I'm significantly older and have a better grasp on that sort of feeling, I can confidently make videos like these and talk for hours about why I love what I love. And for this case specifically, I think its essence is very simple. Shoujo Tsubaki is a story I've always felt attracted to because its avant-garde nature in and of itself is an attack on common sensibilities regarding art. One intent on forcing you to put into question your own relationship and stance about it, about aesthetics, about what makes a story tick. Suehiro Maru's art style owes so much to very deep topics like historical notions of ancient fine arts, of common military propaganda from World War II. I think it's pretty blatant in that too. Especially when the page that introduced our main cast at the start of the manga features motherfucking Kita alongside our cavalry of weirdos. The man was a pretty important figure ideologically speaking relating to the rise of fascism in Japan amongst many other topics he's touched. Dude was apparently pretty fucking ghoulish as he's described to be a massive inspo for all sorts of far-right politics in the 30s, which then fed even more into the rampant imperialistic views of the time. To intertwine these very traditionalistic elements, like the ukiyo-e-inspired art, on top of that militarized propaganda, something extremely relevant at the time of its creation, especially in the recontextualization of Japan's past, is an absolute power move coming from Maruo, forcing people to reckon with the idea that the disturbing imagery and avid cruelty stems from somewhere deeper than its looks. I think one of the coolest elements on its own is the character of Muchisute, the mummy man. He's very obviously a parody of that sort of ideal picture Japan had of young men of the age to serve in the military service, especially in that time. He's wearing a dirty military uniform, all torn and ragged. His face is covered in bandages to hide the state of his skin, disfigured and effectively missing both of his arms. He's almost the karmic opposite of what the ideal young soldier was meant to be propaganda-wise, one who would proudly and bravely represent his country at all costs. Instead, here he's broken, tattered, and now rendered actively malicious, a very real threat to our protagonist. I think it's really cool to use elements like these, but entirely in service of recontextualizing them within the scope of what makes a human cruel in the first place. It's meant to shock, but never for that purpose alone. It's forcing you to think about what makes the story function as a whole. What is beautiful? What is ugly? What is cruelty? What is kindness? How do you even proceed to quantify elements like that, right? Shoujo Tsubaki is constantly on your ass, showing you all these horrible things happening to a character that most defo didn't deserve anything that's happened to her. A little girl just trying to survive no matter what, shoved into this overly cruel reflection of our very own reality, but it never asks nor tells you why, almost as a sign that these things happen no matter what, without rhyme or reason. Instead, you just gotta come up to your own conclusions about it. By dressing its entire setting in that sort of vibe, one whose roots come all the way back from these extremely beautiful pieces of art, it's asking you if that beauty can still be considered pure if it's now desecrated. Can Midori still be considered pure if she's been battered and beaten to the ground by the circumstances around her? Can the art still be considered gorgeous when it's meant to represent the hopeless darkness living in humanity? I don't know about you, but I found that sort of thought process really special. Kinda related, kinda unrelated, but lately I've been finding myself watching and rewatching the few Hiroshi Arata projects that are available online. Partly for this video, because obviously he worked on Midori, and his works fit squarely within that same lineage of era guro works, but really, mostly because it just feels right. Granted, saying this doesn't really mean much, since the dude's also worked in the mainstream anime industry. Funnily enough, doing storyboards, directing episodes, and tons of key animation for fucking Kirby right back at you, out of all things. But here I specifically mean that I've been watching his indie stuff. You know, the shit he toiled on in secret, at home, in between gigs, completely by himself. And I don't know, I just think about it a lot. Maybe part of that is because I relate to the whole working alone mindset, heads down for months at a time in a dingy room trying to produce something decent that folks will gawk at for a little bit. Or maybe it's just my sentimentalism showing some form of basic entry-level empathy for a fellow creator who's had it pretty rough over the years. I think a lot of people who jump straight into Midori kinda miss the necessary context that comes from watching the rest of his work. Like, legit, if you enjoy that sort of deep-seated commentary about society's woes present in his adaptation, his original stuff is just filled to the brim with even more of that. Commentaries about social inequalities, loneliness, harassment, bullying, death, coming to terms with Japan's actions in the past, coming to terms with one's own place in the world when it all feels like everything is set up against you. It's really prescient stuff that I feel a lot of people could relate to, now more than ever. Like, Death Lullaby is the prime example that comes to mind when talking about that sort of feeling. Especially when after about 10 minutes of getting flashbang back to back, you're met with the narrator singing the lyrics, "Who notices my corpse if I die alone?" And man, did I ever feel that in my soul. Same thing for Limitless Paradise, whose plot entirely revolves around a boy who's fed up with the treatment he receives by adults while doing student council duties, finally deciding to rebel against school, against the Board of Education, against society itself, going to the length of occupying the school with his classmates, a defiant move that puts into question topics like police brutality, inequality, and that sort of adult-child power imbalance. To me, that stuff is straight up galvanizing. I watch it and immediately feel some form of kinship in my soul. Not just because of its pretty overt themes concerning angst, but also because the whole thing looks fucking gorgeous. A lot of folks, especially when looking at more mainstream projects, fail to realize just how much work, let alone passion, goes into producing any form of animation, no matter how simple. This applies especially so if the animation in question is made entirely by one single person's cumulative sweat, blood, and tears. I remember hearing a lot of fuss about Harada's style being very unconventional, uncomfortable, very rough to look at, not just because of the amount of flashing images present on screen. I mean, seriously, my eyes are feeling more and more sensitive with age, but regarding his very own designs. The way he draws characters is pretty singular, mind you, and I don't know, I really fuck with that. It almost showcases a particular sense of humanity to it, like a very purposeful direction. I've talked about that when it came to Nekojiru and how she personally used her own perception of the world around her to inform how she would draw people, but that shit applies to pretty much every artist out there. Harada's stories are one of devastating injustice, so it makes sense that the world he portrays reflect that harshness in every particle of its being. Like recently I found a copy of his 1994 work, My Love, and it's just drenched in that same ethos. Truly beautiful in how perfectly ugly it is, as silly as that might sound for some. The actual quality of the rip I have being really fucking low almost accentuates the noxious vibe the whole thing has. Like watching something truly cursed, actually haunted, but now stuck forevermore on one of my many dusty SSDs. I fucking love that thing. And that's not even mentioning that in the middle of making this video, completely unprompted, it was announced that he was releasing a new movie very soon. A fucking 3.5 hours worth of beautifully made animation just screaming his name that he's apparently been working on in complete secrecy for the past 30 years. Like, holy shit. So many of his works feel exactly like that, as if you could get jump scared, absolutely flashbanged by God knows what at any moment. And I think that quality particularly comes from how he was perceived on the internet. For the longest time, his works weren't particularly available. I'm not one to call shit lost media unless it's actually factually lost, but so much of what he made was just shrouded in mystery and questions for years at a time, and that ended up leaving a lot of place for speculation. Some rightfully so, I mean, just look at this thing's vibes, and other kinda perpetrating the same unfounded rumors over and over. Like so many people still talk about Midori being banned, but the reality is a lot more simple than that. Chika Gento Gekiga Shoujo Tsubaki was screened in theaters entirely unedited until the year 1994, where Japanese Film Censor Board ARIN requested cuts to be made because of the graphic nature of the film itself. While a lot of rumors surround themselves around the idea that the film's been banned everywhere since then, it was in that exact same year that it also premiered in France, albeit in its censored form, but it still continued to be shown in different international film festivals ever since. Though minus the performance aspect that went with the whole underground show thing they had going on. No home releases were made in Japan, but in 2006 the French company Ciné Malta were allowed to release the 1992 uncensored cut on DVD under the title Midori, which is probably the version most of you are familiar with still to this day. In 2013, the original 16mm negative of the film was rediscovered just laying there, completely untouched for years in a Japanese post-production company's warehouse, and Hiroshi Arata's company, Kiryukan, decided to remaster it. All in all, Shoujo Tsubaki has been reprinted more times than I can count, in more languages than I can speak, even arriving in the United States prior to anime and manga becoming these massive entertainment juggernauts a la Pokemania. So I feel like it's kinda dumb to perpetuate the long story about how Midori is the most banned anime ever. This shit's got mighty credentials when it comes to influence and lineage. I don't want to spend too much time talking about folks who have regressive views about art, but the more I tried to fight against the impulse of doing so in the first place, even just mentioning it passively, the harder I had of a time even writing this entire segment. It's an issue that's practically impossible to skirt around when it comes to talking about the movie. Because when Midori is discussed nowadays, the conversation is almost entirely dominated by folks who think it's just the grossest thing ever, like ew, look at the puppy scene. I feel like I was genuinely thrown back 20 years in the past with the same levels of discourse that was stemming out of Elfen Lied's own puppy scene. Like it's so inconsequential, because both of these are framed entirely to bring out your empathy towards the main character, less so out of a need to gross its audience out. Part of me feels like making this entire thing about that sort of reaction or whatever is kinda lame and stupid. It's playing into the idea that Midori is either an anti-reactionary masterpiece or something that needs to be actively hidden from children. I feel like all of those needless arguments become more and more tiring, especially in this modern day landscape. Like it's such a tremendous disservice to the actual art in question, to almost solely focus on how a public of 12-year-olds accidentally stumbling upon it brought a wave of neo-puritanism in anime circles. I've always been one who prefers to focus on the emotionally earnest rather than the sarcastically disconnected. And there's a whole ass version of this script that definitely went even more into detail about this, and the way regressive opinions arms heart all around, but it's just so tiring. People who think that stuff like this is so offensive and should be erased won't even get this far into the vid, so it's like, does this even matter? And no matter what, deep down in my chest, I can't shake the feeling that, yeah, it really does matter to me. It'd be pretty irresponsible of me to go out of my way and try to pin the entire blame for this sort of overblown reaction on the younger generation's actions, one I'm not even a part of, but also it's been a really weird feeling to see more and more teenagers and young adults online talking about weird art exactly like how your boomer parents would talk about Dungeons and Dragons, Magic the Gathering, or Pokemon. Is this reference even gonna make sense to folks anymore, or am I just too old? Did people forget the moral panic surrounding them? I think in the current state of the internet, there's been more and more of a rise in communities that straight up can't understand the purpose of art that doesn't immediately conform to their own stylistic sensibilities, as if artistic integrity was only ever meant to fit their own preconceived notions of it. And look, I'm pretty guilty of some of that too. I've got very peculiar taste that oftentimes get described as maliciously eclectic, but I also understood very early on in life that even the art I personally dislike remains art no matter what. With something as wide as the internet, where you can find practically everything at the tip of your fingers at literally any moment, it's becoming more of an issue. The idea that any form of art containing relatively touchy subjects can find its way readily available for an audience that doesn't yet have the emotional maturity or knowledge to properly parse it. Not that there's any shame to that. Like, when you're young, you're naturally curious. At least I was. And if something gets described to you as the quote-unquote most turbo fucked up thing in the world, it's kinda natural you wanna seek it out, right? Unfortunately, folks tend to immediately gut reaction that shit, and oftentimes it's for the worse. The biggest issue comes from people who, instead of disengaging from the stuff that makes them uncomfy, choose to make it everyone else's problem. I think there's a lot to be said about how younger audiences grew overly puritanical in the last decade and a half, give or take. Like there's a fine line between I don't fuck with it, so I won't watch it, and I don't like it, so no one else should. That's kind of my big problem with that sort of more fandomized approach to art, if you get what I mean. People taking overly protective stances about what should or shouldn't be allowed concerning entirely fictional characters, kinda leading way to a lot of stuff getting overly sanitized to conform to that sort of mindset, that entirely reductive view taken towards art. It's not like everyone's like that, thank fuck, but the internet as a concept makes it a lot easier to spot nowadays, especially given the tendency of current online landscapes being absolute fucking cesspools opinion-wise. That stuff, to me, becomes really awkward, because it's actively threatening the state of art itself. It's like how some people can't grasp with the idea that an author writing a villainous character doing horrible fucked up things isn't the same as condoning or endorsing those same actions. There's people out there who genuinely believe Midori to be this diametrically evil film because they see the abuse depicted within it and think of it as something like gratification for its intended audience. And I don't know, maybe it's just me, but I think that seeing the things in that movie, especially framed the way they are, it's pretty obvious that you're not supposed to be enjoying any of it. None of it is made for that purpose. As a matter of fact, quite the opposite. It's meant to show you that the world is an eternally cruel place and to build your empathy and therefore hopes for Midori herself. There's a world of difference between media that talks about taboo topics and stuff that comes from a place of exploitation and fetishization towards those very same subjects. I see that often concerning the guro sphere coming mostly from outsiders who never really bothered to do their research beforehand, as if that movement wasn't entirely based from the start out of a purely anti-fascist sentiment, literally built to be a criticism of it. It's a huge part of that scene's history, and don't get me started about how folks spent years confusing guro as a term. So many folks still to this day don't know that the guro part of it means grotesque, as in unappealing, ugly, unconventional. Like yeah, guro works do often feature gory elements, but it's not exclusively gore. If you're looking for that, that's called Riona, and that's for a whole ass different video. Don't Google that shit though. Part of me worries that one of the big reasons behind this puritanical rebirth stems from the idea that those uncomfortable topics come from a very real place of honesty, of vulnerability, and that those qualities are now seen as threatening to an era mostly erring towards the side of stuff made entirely by executives. Market research, focus-tested, clean and cropped lowest common denominator slop. That sort of typical overreaction aimed towards even the most basic of exploration of moral taboos is just downright demoralizing. And honestly, I can't help but feel like it's entirely connected to a sort of anti-intellectual stance we're seeing nowadays, where suddenly you got folks calling you a pretentious asshole for not wanting to watch the latest cynically made, mass-marketed product by giant global corpos. Like, I don't know. To me, art carries such a personal connotation, not just towards me myself, but towards the folks who made it in the first place. It's why I approach everything as a sort of two-way conversation between their work and how it made me feel, both in the moment and in retrospect. So to see people throw stuff like Midori under the bus, labeling it as pure shock value feels so incredibly reductive to the medium. The very idea that a piece of art doesn't conform to their own stance is the offense itself. So you see folks approaching that stuff with a puritanical mindset that if they're ever made uncomfortable, or sad, or angry, or any sort of negative emotion, it must be the artist's fault for being actively abusing towards their audience, instead of being something to reckon with, to reflect on. A slow process that effectively allows you to grow as a human being. Those folks will wake up one day and realize that they've basically become a new generation molded entirely by hyper-conservative beliefs, effectively stripped of their own agency towards art, just endlessly regurgitating the same old dogma repackaged over and over again about different topics, all in the hopes of quelling that chronically online moral superiority and flexing it over some other internet weirdo. They'll become a generation of people having done truly irreparable damage to how art is perceived and talked about in online communities, in turn turning into a murder of crows, ever wanting to consume but never taking the time to appreciate. It's exactly how I feel regarding stuff like iceberg videos, and the crowd it attracts too. It's almost like folks just want the thrill that comes with the quote-unquote fucked up, but without the emotional baggage that comes with it. They don't want to come to terms with why it's that way or why they even feel attracted to that sort of void. They want to get spoon-fed, easily classifiable information by some narrator instead of experiencing truly unbridled outsider art and having to question themselves why it made them feel that way. Absolutely wild stuff. It's just really fucked to see how the internet's taken a turn, becoming more and more reactionary and judgmental over the years. People make assumptions about you entirely based on the art you like, and it's just so fucking lame. So much of the conversation surrounding what is or isn't ethical consumption bores me to death. It's always the same points regurgitated by either bad faith actors trying to gotcha you, or teenagers with mad anxiety thinking they'll go to hell for reading Chainsaw Man. Because truth be told, I really do hate the way people talk online about quote-unquote problematic media, as if it's all equally morally wrong. Sometimes art just happens to talk about fucked up topics, but there's intent behind that. And don't get me wrong, it's totally fine if that's something you personally don't want to experience or can't stomach. Everyone's got their limits, and that's super understandable. But the call for the suppression of transgressive art is inherently reactionary on its own. Because if that's your first move when experiencing challenging art, stuff that makes you feel uncomfortable, it's no different than what actual fascists historically did when it came to any art they personally disagreed with. Look up degenerate art on Wikipedia and read up on it. Trust me, it's gonna be hella worth it. The thing is, people who cry for censorship are pretty much always hiding behind a deeply regressive and puritanical agenda. I've seen an article just a few months ago about a state in the US banning a book because it was being read from right to left instead of the more traditional Western conventions of left to right. Oh, and also because they went full mask off in the middle of that same article because the manga portrayed LGBTQ+ relationships. Go fucking figure. Censorship won't make kids safe online or offline. It's this all-encompassing oppressive tool that has zero nuance whatsoever. It's used by conservative old fucks to take away the art you love bit by bit, especially so if it depicts topics they personally don't approve of. Anything that opposes their retrograde values is something they'll actively want to see disappear for everyone else. So you gotta oppose that shit, no matter how messed up, how gross, how objectionable you think the art in question is, because it's a real slippery slope. Give them an inch, they'll take a mile, every fucking time. And that's not to say that I think of myself as any sort of authority on a subject as broad and complicated as censorship can be. I'm not even close to that. I'm just a random fuck who happens to be a little too passionate about the art I enjoy. But like, it gets tiring sometimes, you know? I'd be in a much better mood every day if the popular discourse surrounding the stuff I love wasn't entirely fixated on whether or not it makes me a morally reprehensible person for enjoying them. So recently I took some time off from this video because I was legit stressing day in, day out, working on it for sometimes up to 10 hours straight, just agonizing at my desk. A lot of the notions presented within this are ones where I spent nights writing and rewriting even the most basic sentence to hopefully get my point across clearly, to make sure it made sense. That, on top of worrying about taking too much time even just making it, kinda bubbled over in a way. And on one of those nights where the temptation to rip my face off was there, I ended up watching Pastoral to Die in the Country, this movie by Shuji Terayama. I'd only ever heard of that title before within the greater context of Suehiro Maruo's apparent big-time enjoyment of it. Same thing with the connection between it and Midori, with J.A. Caesar doing both soundtracks. Also, funny coincidence that I only put together after watching it. Kazuichi Hanawa, the artist I mentioned earlier that collaborated with Maruo on the ukiyo-e art book, was responsible for the poster for Pastoral. But yeah, besides that, I wasn't particularly familiar with it, nor anything from Terayama's body of work, so I kinda had to go in blind. And honestly, I couldn't have predicted coming out of it with such a fervent desire to watch the rest of this dude's filmography. The experience absolutely blindsided me, and probably changed me for the better, all things considered. Funny thing too is that you can really tell from just a glance that Maruo's work is deeply inspired by Terayama's whole vibe, something you can spot pretty easily in shoujo tsubaki. For one, you can clearly tell from the circus scenes that this movie left a massive crater-like impact in his brain, not just aesthetically speaking, but also tonally as well. And for two, that tonal quality doesn't just apply to this story, but also pretty much everything else he's made along the way. Though right now I'm speaking of it mostly in how it affected the creation of Midori's story. The movie itself revolves around another teenager, Shin, whose desire to leave their homes less than pleasant circumstances lead them to a circus amongst many other places, having their view of the world change alongside the many people they meet on the way there, something pretty similar to how Midori's journey went on. Similarly, its vibes match almost to a T, with the whole movie relying so heavily on vertical slices type storytelling, going from one fragmented memory to another, using all kinds of dream logic to give you a bigger picture by the end, Shout out specifically to the way color is handled in Pastoral, with these incredible shots all around. I think one of my favorite stylistic choices coming from the movie is just how Shin looks. His face is painted stark white, something usually done in Japanese cinema to portray ghosts or wandering spirits. He wears a gakuran, a school uniform, that I typically associate with Gekiga-style comics or the Eraguro scene, thinking specifically of the boys from Lychee Light Club, kinda emphasizing the troubled emotions that come from teenagehood. It's something you can also see deeply within all of Sue Hiromara's body of work. Right from the start, not just the premise of it, but the movie's entire ethos feels incredibly related to shoujo tsubaki, which makes sense since apparently it was a massive inspiration for Maro in the making of his own art. The stylish anachronicity of the mixed media used in the movie not only acts as this really cool stylistic counterpart to Hiroshi Arata's OVA, but also to Maro's art style on its own. Plus, it lends itself so well to the idea of time metaphorically slipping out, passing by and changing as the story sees fit. That's something the movie focused tremendously on. There's a massive emphasis on the concept of time, the lack of it, the desire to preserve or gain even more, usually represented by the presence of a clock or even watches, going as far as to represent the literal agency that comes with the passage of time, the very act of growing up, now gaining your own time. Because the entire reason why Shin even wants to skip town is that his mom's practically keeping him shackled there and he feels like time is just slipping by him, constantly hoping for a life that might not even become his. In a way, clocks almost represent the feeling of freedom, both literally and figuratively, as you can see in the circus scenes where every member of the troupe have their own watches and act pretty fucking liberated of all social malaise, fucking and chuckling all day long in this sort of laissez-faire attitude concerning anything around them. Similarly, the inverse scenario applies too. Our protagonist, post-trauma-filled coitus, ends up being given a watch of his own by the woman who just got done abusing him, almost like this spit in the face. This reminder that he was forced in an instant to grow up too quickly, only gaining his freedom after getting taken advantage of. And that sort of theme is something underlined throughout the entire thing. I mean, at some point it's even revealed through clever editing techniques that this was never anything other than time that was already gone. The film truthfully being this autobiographical work which uses the framing of a coming-of-age story that kind of question what it even means. A film within a film, unfinished, and with its director trying to capture a picture of his childhood that may or may not be what he thinks it is. He even goes to the length of busting it all down, literally visiting the past and taking the responsibility to enact the change he wants to see after a major case of writer's block. I think a lot about that, not just because of how relevant it is to Midori's own story, but because of how it relates to the making of this vid even. I mean, here I am talking about the film representing its creator's anxiety and eventual coming to terms with finishing it, in a video entirely about its creator's anxiety and eventual coming to terms with finishing it. It's enough to give me a fucking headache, dog. In a way, it almost feels like a natural progression of this sort of concept, Pastoral imparting its themes to shoujo tsubaki, and that imparting its themes onto this very video. Because after all, if there's one emotional through line throughout this entire fucking thing, it's the underlying theme of the inherent suffering that comes with growing up. More specifically, of having to crawl through the trauma of having to grow up too fast. It might seem obvious to some, especially pointed out this way, but really, I think it's such a massively under-talked facet about what makes shoujo tsubaki, its adaptations, and Pastoral to Die in the Country feel so special to me. Everything I've talked about today speaks openly and wholeheartedly of incredibly prescient feelings, of the very real pains that come from having your childhood kneecapped before you even had the chance to grow out of it. To have that already very shaky transitional stage in life, some of the most crucial years to a person's development, the fragile era between teenage and adulthood broken in, forcefully kick-started against your will, by the world around you, by circumstances out of your control, by people you might have trusted, but all coalescing into the logical conclusion for a video like this. In a way, I guess that's why I take such a big offense to people immediately dismissing Midori as this thing purely made for shock value, as if someone would animate a 40+ minute OVA by himself for 5 years, risking his livelihood in the process, to produce something that would simply and gratuitously damage your audience's sense of good grace, whatever the fuck that even means. The desire to restrict that kind of self-expression, as uncomfortable as it may be, feels particularly insulting, when what you see out of that art is a reflection of your very own feelings regarding the hurt you've gone through. And it's no secret that most folks who end up fucking with that kind of raw, emotional transgressiveness, myself included, find themselves relating to that stuff more often than not. So to get told by some angry folks online who won't listen that my feelings aren't okay to discuss, to explore in this manner, that they aren't valid to live through, it leaves a really bad taste in my mouth, you know? Because to me, art has always been my one true escape from all this shit. The thing that sheltered me from all of the bad stuff I'd experience on the daily, growing up or otherwise. So if I don't got that, then what else do I have, right? To find art that talks about what you personally experience, that speaks about whichever manner of feelings that keeps your mind running at night, even if left vague or purposefully confusing, that shit means the absolute world to you, especially if you're still a kid. To create art that shocks, that disturbs, that leaves people questioning what they even saw feels almost intrinsically tied to the human experience. At least in my experience of it. To me, it's always felt a whole lot more like a conversation, a connection, rather than something purely noted down as another notch on a giant checklist. Plus, I'd much rather have stories that touch upon real human conditions than the same cynically made regurgitation all the time. I wholeheartedly reject a world that would have me subjected to only that. I think nowadays, more than ever, there's a need for genuineness. There's been such a gigantic pushback against the sort of review or commentary that focus solely on being quote-unquote objective, because in the end, that shit is just straight up impossible. Folks will always gravitate to what they perceive is like them, even tangentially so. They look for what's quantifiably human, capable of expressing emotions, feelings, complex thoughts, and I'm no different. Subjective till the end, I guess. I might have never skipped town to go work at a circus, or ran away from home in hopes of eloping with the older MILF neighbor, but I know what it's like to feel like you've got no one else to rely on, that you're just gonna have to trudge through this shit your entire life alone. I know what it's like to have been abused by someone you love, in a way that irrevocably shatters your entire sense of self, leaving you to pick up the pieces years down the line. What those stories portray is so incredibly relatable on this almost primal level of consciousness that if you open your heart to them and truly engage with what they've got to offer, I find it really hard not to immediately understand what they're going for. As brutal as those fragments of reality can be, the sensation sinking in that the world is a cruel, unjust place and has been for as long as we've existed, that sometimes bad things happen to good people, and there's never really a logical explanation or a rationale behind it, it just is. But it also means that you can't stop, you know? I can't ever go back in time to unfuck my life, to fix all my problems. The clock just keeps on ticking no matter how painful that shit is. Just like Shin, just like Midori, you can never be the same. From now on, all you can do is be different.